On one of her last Sundays here, one of the most quirky, wonderful people I've ever known, Nancy Wood, asked me if I would sometime preach a sermon on the 23rd Psalm, but I had to wait till she was back. Well, she never made it back. In fact, the flowers we have up here today are from her funeral that was this past week. So I guess I've never dedicated a sermon to someone before, but I guess this sermon is sort of dedicated to Nancy and kind of her wonderful, quirky nature. And specifically, with the 23rd Psalm, I'm pretty certain that a few of you, when we were reading it in the opening, were like, well, this isn't the right 23rd Psalm. This is all the wrong words, because it's one of those things we know so well. And don't worry for those of you who are fans of the poetry of the Psalms of the King James Version of the 23rd Psalm. We will get it before this sermon is over. But specifically, the 23rd Psalm, it is so good at capturing the dynamics of our relationship with God. But I want to stop for a second and talk about that word dynamics. Many years ago, I had hoped to become an engineer, and I was studying mechanical engineering and taking all the different classes you have to take, and I took a class called statics, which some of you might know. Well, for sure one of you I know has had that class. Statics is sort of the science behind things that aren't moving, like load-bearing walls and those shelves on the wall holding up that speaker, all the mathematical equations of how those things work. And I took statics, and I passed, maybe just because my teacher liked me, because I didn't understand. And then he told us the next class you will take is going to be dynamics, where we're studying all these forces and pressures on things that are moving. And I'm like, okay, I'm done. Uncle, I can't go. I just don't understand the math anymore. And so what dynamics is, really, it's a branch of mechanics concerned with the motion of bodies under the action of forces. Here's the bottom line. Dynamics means things are moving and things are complicated. That is a saying our kids hear in our house all the time. When they ask a question, when they're looking for a simple answer, we'll say, well, it's complicated, especially if people are involved. Anything involving people is complicated. And so this understanding our relationship, the dynamics of our relationships with God, the 23rd Psalm is a great window into that. So I'm just going to put up here the King James Version, the old one that so many people, if you hear the 23rd Psalm in a movie, it's probably going to be the King James Version. One, it's not copyrighted, so they can use it for free. But also, it's ubiquitous. It's all over. Everybody seems to know that one. And also, the King James is the most influential. Most English translations, I'd say all English translations since then, in some way have been influenced by the King James use of language. And we'll see a couple of those things in this as we go through it. So it begins, "The Lord is my shepherd." Now this psalm was written by David, King David, who himself was a shepherd. And in fact, when he was going to fight Goliath, and he was just a boy, and Saul was the king, Saul's like, you can't fight him. I think some of you may have heard a sermon about this a few weeks ago when I was gone. He said, you can't be a king, or you can't be he's been a warrior since he was a child. You are just a child. And David's response is, I'm a shepherd. When a wild animal comes to attack my flock, I protect them. And I've killed wild animals, that are scarier than Goliath is, protecting my sheep. So David knows what he's talking about when he says, the Lord is my shepherd. He knows what it takes to be a good shepherd. And he says, the Lord is his shepherd. I shall not want. The Lord, he said, he's providing me with what I need. This is the same thought as when Jesus taught the disciples to pray, and he taught them to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." And daily bread meaning everything we need for daily life, that we need to understand our dependence on the Lord in those ways. He makes me lie down in green pastures. This is a statement on peace and tranquility in life, which if anybody knew about the disruptions of peace and tranquility, it was David, because first when he was in the service to King Saul, Saul tried to kill him, and he spent many years running away, hiding. And then when he was king, his own son led a rebellion against him. So he had this great appreciation for these green pastures, for this time of quiet, this time of solitude, this time of tranquility that the Lord could provide. He said, "He leadeth me beside the still waters." Because so much of David's life, and we all experience this, our lives are not still waters. They're raging flood waters threatening to sweep us away. So David has said when he's beside those still waters, it's the Lord who's bringing him there. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. We prayed that in our prayer of the day today. We prayed, "Give us wisdom to use these gifts and blessings so they'll be of service to others and bring honor and glory to you." That's exactly what David is saying, that God leads him on the right path. The right path, sometimes people want to just reduce that to sort of being a moral person. That's not what it is. That's a part of it. But the right paths are all about relationships. David is saying his relationship with God, and then that relationship with God frames all of his relationships with other people. This is why when King Saul wanted to kill David, and David's men encouraged him, "Saul wants to kill you, you kill Saul, then you'll be king." He said, "No, I won't do that. I won't partake in his corrupt violence." Those are the right paths he's talking about. He says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Here's where, the first time we see really this sort of the linguistic styles of the people who translated the King James come to bear. That's such a powerful phrase. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Back in, I suppose it was about the late 80s or maybe around 1990, when the New Revised Standard Version came out, they changed that to actually a more accurate literal translation where it says, "Though I walk through the deepest, darkest valley." And people were like, "That's not what it says." They were like, "Well, in the Hebrew, that is what it says." But we can relate so much to this imagery of the valley of the shadow of death. I would say when the King James translators, they translated that metaphorically rather than literally, because literally it is a deep, dark valley. But metaphorically, what it's talking about is those times in our life when it seems that all the light and goodness in our life has been taken away from us. And the language, the valley of the shadow of death, just captures that idea so well. That David is saying, when I'm in that place, when I'm hiding from King Saul who wants to kill me, when my own son leads a rebellion and I have to flee my home for my safety in that valley of the shadow of death, I'm not afraid. I don't fear the evil that is against me. He says, "For you are with me. You art with me. You are with me. So why should I be afraid of some other human who's out to get me?" Or to take it to another level, if we think of Jesus and his interaction in the spiritual realm when people were possessed by evil spirits, Jesus is like, "You don't need to be afraid of these. They have no power over me." And we see that time and time again when Jesus is able to have control over those spiritual elements. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." The tools of the trade for a shepherd, the rod and the staff. He says, you're using those to protect me. That little video we watched, I am just so in awe of people who can get such a powerful message across in such a simple way, using nothing but a line, some balls, and those broken pieces. And I really like that part where these big, giant, spiky things are coming in on the little ball, and the shield stops them. The rod and the staff. They comfort me. They protect me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. We all encounter well-meaning people who just don't get it sometimes. And one of my last classes at seminary was a class on the Psalms. And of course, so one of the Psalms we studied was Psalm 23. And I was in a small group with other students, and one of the students tried to convince us that this passage means it's about reconciliation. We're like, no, it's not about reconciliation. It is about someone who has been persecuted by people in the world who want to do harm to them because they are a follower of Christ. Now they're getting the honor of eating a meal set by Christ. It is vindication, not reconciliation. And I know that's not a message we really want to hear right now, because we are in a country that is in such need of reconciliation. We have too much people trying to be vindicated against each other going on. But that's the message here, is this person, in David's case, since he wrote this, we'll use his own case. When Saul wanted to kill him, when his own son rose up against him and wanted to kill him and steal the throne, and David did not respond in kind, he was vindicated in the end, because he didn't respond in kind. He trusted that the Lord would take care of these things. And in the end, it worked out in the plan that the Lord had, that David would continue to be the king and be the shepherd for those people. So he says, thou anointest my head with oil. David would have known this for sure, because kings were anointed with oil, or they, in places that have royalty, they still are anointed with oil when they become the king or the queen. My cup runneth over. It's abundance. He's talking about abundance here in his life. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And here is the point where every time we use this psalm, Nancy would come up to me and talk to me about a couple of words that are used there. So here's the line. And here's the different translations as it's put forward. It says, surely goodness and mercy, or love, or loving kindness shall follow, pursue, chase after me all the days of my life. Now, the word that's translated mercy, love, and loving kindness, that's pretty simple, because it can be translated, although they all mean about the same thing. But this difference between follow and pursue makes all the difference. Most translations in English still use follow, because that's what the King James used. That was the linguistic styling they used there. That all the days of my life will be followed by goodness and mercy. But follow is more passive. Pursue is more active. Chase after is really active. The Hebrew word that David used is radaf. And it can be translated either follow or pursue. It means both. And then when the translators of the King James used this, they followed people long before them who had originally translated the Hebrew into Latin, and they used follow in Latin. And so they just stuck with what the Latin had been, because they were all Latin scholars back then, everybody working with this stuff. But a couple hundred years before Jesus lived, Hebrew was not as widely known anymore as when David lived. Everybody in Israel used Hebrew when David lived. But a couple hundred years later, Jews had spread out. They were living in today what would be Egypt and Turkey and Greece. And in those places, they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. They spoke Greek. And so they translated the Old Testament scripture, the Hebrew Bible, into Greek. So all these Jews who grew up outside of Israel speaking Greek could read it. And when they translated the 23rd Psalm into Greek, the Greek word they used was katadiako, which means to chase after. It cannot mean to follow. The Greeks had a whole different word for follow. So the Hebrew people themselves, at least in the time about 200 years before Jesus lived, the way they understood this was that God is chasing after them. And when I talk about the dynamics of our relationship with God, this is what I'm talking about. That I got just a little graphic I'll put up there. Running along, getting followed by mercy and goodness. That this understanding, and this goes to the very root of our understanding of ourselves as people, created in God's image, but tainted by sin. So we have this kind of tension going on there. And in this tension, it's like, yeah, we are created in God's image. We are unique in that sense. But on the other hand, we're born with this broken human nature. And I've always found it interesting as a pastor, a theologian, a biblical scholar, I've always found it interesting that we use the word humanity to talk about what we want to think of as all the best stuff of people, when really humanity is our worst part. That's the worst part of it. The best part of us is the part of the image of God. And if you want to put it in the simplest terms, way back in the early days of cartoons, when they would show someone thinking and you had a little angel and a little devil on your shoulder, that's a simplistic, easy way to understand what's going on in our own selves. And so God pursuing us becomes the defining point of our relationship with God. It says, while we were yet sinners, Paul wrote, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He pursued us. He didn't wait for us to get our act together. In many ways, being a Christian is all on-the-job training, because we're all hired for this task without the skills or qualifications to do it. But it's because this God is pursuing us, His goodness and His mercy pursue us, that then defines our lives, not just in relationship to God, but it should, as Christians, it should define our lives in relationship to each other. And understanding that we as broken people, this is, I'll just give you a little piece of advice. If somebody ever wants to get in a discussion with you, a debate with you on do humans have free will or not, don't do it. Don't do it. You can't win. There's no win in that argument. Because you have a large group of Christians say, yes, we have free will. We have to have free will so we can choose God. Well, the problem there is you've just turned faith into a work that we do. And if we could choose God, we don't need Jesus. On the other hand, they have those who say, we don't have free will. God's just in control of everything. And basically, we're puppets on a string. And it's like, wait a minute. Bible says we're saved by faith. Where's faith in this equation? The reality is we do have a will. And we have the ability to choose things and to not do things. But that will is corrupted and tainted by our sinful human nature. It's again, the Apostle Paul, he says, I know what the good is, But too often I choose the bad. And if the Apostle Paul, who's like the superstar of all apostle missionary preachers who ever lived, admits that he can't always choose to do the good, I'm not going to say I can do any better. I have the ability to choose, but my choices are corrupted. They're tainted. So yeah, I can choose and say Jesus is my Lord and Savior. But I have to have the self-understanding to know that sometimes I could do that for the wrong reasons. I could do it for selfish reasons. I could do it without really understanding the implications of it. That's why God, the vision of God pursuing us is so important. God takes care of the hard stuff. Really, all we have to do then is live within His pursuit of us. He really makes it a lot easier for us that He is pursuing us. He is chasing after us. And the tense, I love this. I'm not a grammar guy. Grammar to me, it intrigues me like a machine intrigues a little kid that, you're taking stuff apart all the time. You can never get it back together. I don't understand grammar, but it intrigues me. And the word radaf that's used for pursue is in what's called the imperfect tense. And what that means is it's an action that was going on in the past. God was pursuing us. It's still going on in the present. God is pursuing us. And it will continue to go on in the future. God continues to pursue us, and God will pursue us until it reaches its objective. In other words, goodness and mercy pursue us all the days of our lives. All the days of our lives, goodness and mercy pursue us. God is pursuing us always and will not stop until He has us. Until we get our resurrected bodies, when finally all of this conflicted humanness in us is finally replaced by the presence of God. One of the great stories in the Bible, it's not a super well-known story, but it's a telling story. It's in Genesis chapter 14. And Abraham, who if you know the story about Abraham, his name hasn't even been changed to Abraham yet. They're still called Abram. It's Abram and Sarai still in Genesis 14. He's just been called by God, and he's traveling, and his nephew Lot and his family have come with him, and they're kind of wandering around as God tells them where to go. And Lot, who wasn't really good at making life choices sometimes, he gets captured by some really bad people. And it says that Abraham gathered together a group of men and radaf Lot. They chased after Lot. They chased after the bad guys until they freed Lot and rescued him. That's what it means by the tense of that word being. It's keeping, it always goes until it reaches his accomplishment. Abraham rescued Lot, then he didn't radaf anymore. He didn't chase after him anymore because he had him. Now, I'm using this as a segue here, complete change of topic. Several months ago, I had a crazy idea. And some of you know I'm pretty good friends with Pastor John Kermott over at First Baptist. And I sent him an email and I said, hey, I got a crazy idea. What if you and I did a sermon series together, preaching this on the same topics on something? And what if we could get our churches to do Bible studies together? And because I said, I know you have a lot of people there who have friends to go to Word of Life, and we have a lot of people here. I know have friends who go to First Baptist. And I said, wouldn't that be kind of a neat thing to do? It's kind of church cooperation on a whole new level. And he's like, I like that idea. And I ran it by the council here, and he ran it by his leadership at his church, and they're like, that's a really neat idea. And we chose as the topic, well, I say we chose, really it was this is what I wanted to do, and I was looking for someone to do studies with, so that's kind of why I thought of him, on Abraham and the life of Abraham, and how God pursued Abraham and called Abraham to do something new and unique that had never been done before. That Abraham is the very first person, as far as we know, in the whole history of the universe. Abraham was the first person ever that God gave his righteousness to. Because God called Abraham, and it says Abraham believed God, and then it says, and God counted him as righteous. Not because of Abraham, but because of God's promise to him, which is the model of what we say when we say we are saved by faith. Not through anything we do. Abraham hadn't done anything. God said, I'm calling you. I got a job for you. And Abraham's like, okay, sounds good to me. God says, okay, you're righteous now. I give you some of my righteousness. That's what it means to be saved by faith. So I got a little video here introducing the first topic we'll be doing on this. It'll be starting in September. And I'll tell you right now, I'm looking for some people to help with some small group leadership, small group Bible leadership. And if you have other questions, please talk to me about it. So we'll finish with this little video. It's about 1 minute and 20 seconds long or so, and then we'll continue with the service.
What if out of the blue, God came to you and said, I need you to pick up and move, get your stuff together, I'll tell you where to go later. Imagine explaining this to your spouse, your parents, or your best friend. They might think you're crazy and probably talk you out of it. Yet the story of Abram opens exactly this way. God called him out of the blue. On top of that, Abram was not a young man looking for adventure. The Bible tells us he was 75 years old when God singled him out. Think about Sarai, his wife, who probably didn't like the idea of moving, especially with no clue where they were going. But the Bible shows Abram obeying God's call, leaving for an unknown land because of God's promise. By responding in faith to God's call, Abram began a great journey, becoming a follower of God and His promise. Come alongside Abram as he begins his journey, hearing God's call and stepping out in faith.